Hello, and welcome to Based on Facts, where fiction and superstition meet logic and scientific facts on WELT 95.7 FM, broadcasting from the Allen County Public Library. My name is Chris Rex. On today's episode, I'm going to be asking the question, does abortion kill a person? Now, some of you may know that I previously gave a lecture at IPFW on the topic of abortion. The lecture in that particular case was called The Biology Behind Abortion. And the purpose of that talk was basically for me to sit here and break abortion down to the facts and the science behind it. That is to say, kind of discuss some of these things about embryos and fetuses and such that were really not often known to the general public. I also went one step further in that lecture and tried to relate a number of these things to the women themselves that are going through the abortion process and some of the side effects that they may incur along the way as well. And so definitely one of the biggest things we had to crush in that particular lecture was this weird idea. I don't even know where it came from or originated from, but there was this idea that there was a higher chance of breast cancer in women who had abortions. And that's an idea that's been completely destroyed and blown to bits, but was one of the things that one of the audience members at that lecture decided to ask about because she was concerned about that particular topic. And she questioned some of the data that I was providing on that. Now, when it comes to some of the finer nuances, I made a very clear disclaimer at the beginning of that particular lecture that stated that the point of that lecture was not to discuss morals or ethics or anything related to that. Okay, and one of the subtopics that was related to that was this idea of personhood, which is to say, is a fetus or an embryo considered a person? I wasn't going to touch that during that talk. That had nothing to do with the biology behind abortion, which is why I was not going into it at all, because it's a talk all by itself. Well, now it's time to have that talk. Okay. I feel like I've gotten to the point where I kind of need to have this discussion and kind of need to get this information out there. Now, unfortunately, as much as I try, this particular talk is a little more philosophical in nature than I normally like it to be. Okay, and that's frustrating to me. I feel like a failure because of the fact that I can't draw on science as much as I normally would in this particular case. So for this particular episode, I'm not going to be referencing so much science. I will, however, be referencing something else that I believe is very pertinent to this discussion, and that's going to be definitions of certain terms. Because I believe defining terms and fleshing out those terms is going to help us think a little bit more about personhood and as far as what defines a person. Because you really need to take that word apart in order to see what the little parts are, so that we can then get a better grasp on what even a person is before we can say, well, this is a person and that is not a person. So that's really going to be our first task tonight. It's just breaking down this definition of what is a person. What can we consider a person? You know, it starts us thinking about, well, just our own species and thinking about, well, with all this new technology lately, what if we cloned a human being? Would that still be considered a person? And most people would be like, yeah, of course. Yeah, of course. What if we had a situation, a doomsday situation, and we ended up being subverted by machines? And we had a situation like the Matrix, where humans were farmed en masse and basically grown in fields, essentially. Would we still be considered persons in that particular instance? And more often than not, the answer would be, well, yeah, of course. They're still people. Whatever. Okay. Well, let's start thinking maybe more Star Trek-like. Or Star Wars. And start thinking, well, what if we ran into other forms of intelligent life? Would we grant them the right to be called a person? To be treated as a person? If there are other forms of intelligent life, intelligence comparable to our own, would we still be able to consider them people, per se? Because people itself and person, they aren't necessarily uniquely human terms, okay? Because they don't have human anywhere in them. So it's actually a nice, flexible term that we can turn and twist and use to apply to different things based on the differential circumstances of that particular situation. So that starts begging the question, well, if you were in Star Trek, would you consider Klingon to be a person? And once again, more often than not, you would have somebody sit there and think for a bit, but they would concede, yeah, all right, I would consider a Klingon to be a person, sure. If you were watching Star Wars and you were asked, well, do you consider a Twi'lek to be a person? You're like, yeah, all right, I consider them to be people. Yeah, that's fine. So we've now taken the definition of person and expanded it to fill not only humans, but all forms of intelligent life. Okay, so we're expanding that bubble now. What if we had really intelligent androids? Once again, going back to Star Trek, what if we had somebody like Data? Right? Data was one of the characters I grew up with and loved on television. The Next Generation series of Star Trek. And, it always begs that question, well, if you have a really smart machine, a smart machine that appears to be aware of its own presence, that appears to have at least an analog to an emotion, wouldn't you consider that to be a person too? And it's great because this was an overarching theme in a number of the Star Trek Next Generation episodes. Whenever they decided to focus more on Data, the android character, they ended up asking this question rather often. Is he a person? Would he consider himself to be a person? Even though he's not human, does he have enough human-like qualities to justify being called and treated like a person? And so that's a very good question. And after thinking about it, after a few episodes of bouncing it back and forth, I think Star Trek eventually agreed that yes, Data was a person. He displayed enough qualities that were human-like, that were Klingon-like, that were Romulan-like, displayed enough of those qualities that he could be considered on an equal playing field with everyone else. That he deserved the respect, that he deserved the recognition, that he deserved the independence to live out his life how he wished. And that was a very, very, very important step for him as far as his personal growth within the TV series. Now, of course, that personal growth was continued in the movies, which I very much so loved, at least most of them. And kind of climaxed in Nemesis, where he gave his own life, which is the ultimate sacrifice that any person could do for any other person. And Data did that. And it was very touching in that film. Anyway, the whole point, why we go through all this trouble just to define what a person is because we need to have some idea, some starting notion of how we distinguish what a person is versus what is a pet, versus what is property, because really those are the three big ways that we treat the world, and we treat the things in the world. They are either treated as equals, as pets, or as property. Now those are the three biggest ones. Obviously there are subdivisions and other nuances there we're not going to go into. But the distinction is that pets do what you want them to do. Okay, they are set within your confines. All right, and arguably you could almost throw throw children into that category sometimes. Not entirely, obviously, but sometimes I feel like you can kind of lump children in with the pet category. But obviously that tends to be a violation of the law in most places. But then we have the property category. And if we think back, not all that far into the United States past, black people were considered property. Okay? Because of the fact that they were recognized as slaves. And when you're a slave, you are explicitly the property of your master. Now, granted, we still have slaves in today's age, but honestly, there's not a huge overarching theme of slavery in any one particular area. Okay. Now, one can equate certain aspects of cultures and of social situations to be like slavery, but as far as slavery on a massive scale, that really hasn't happened in a while. Okay. You know, at least not since the 1940s, when Hitler did it to the Jews. Okay, that was really the last big time that slavery was done on the scale of millions of people. Now, people could obviously try to make the argument about the child sex slave trade or whatever, the human trafficking trades, but those are really very isolated things. Okay, there's not one location where you can have millions of slaves in one place, but you could see that in Nazi Germany, and before that you could see that in America on the cotton fields. Okay, could see tons of people in a single state that had no rights as people. They were not recognized as persons. They were recognized as property. And that's really very unfortunate. So what we're trying to get at is that the hope for the future is that all persons, that is to say, all humans should be treated equally and be given the rights of people. But there's a caveat to that. When we're trying to go and march for these different sorts of movements and such, we have to keep in mind that when we talk about marching for equality, we're marching for the equality of adults, adult humans. It has nothing to do with children who are kind of in this weird sort of situation to where they're kind of treated as property / pet / child, and are basically under the care of their parent. They're in a weird, mixed up kind of area. And when it comes to fetuses and embryos, that's a whole nother issue entirely. But that's why we're here. We're here to eventually get to that issue. However, we still have to approach this personhood issue from the large perspective. So I think what will help is actually defining the term person. So if we go ahead and break out the old Merriam-Webster dictionary, you will find that person is defined as first and foremost being a human individual. Okay. Now granted, like I said, if we wanted to expand that definition to include intelligent alien species, that first one would have to be changed or amended to accommodate for that. But as of right now, we predominantly think of a person as having to belong to the human species. That is to say, Homo sapiens. Has to be Homo sapien. Not even talking about anything else. Okay, so we're not talking about this idea of including dogs. We're not talking about the idea of including dolphins or elephants or octopuses, any other forms of intelligent life. We're not doing any of that. We're locking it down to what we know and what we accept. And we're not considering intelligent AIs. Okay. I don't believe that they're quite there yet. I could be wrong. MIT might say I'm wrong. But I don't quite believe we're there yet. So, okay, we're limiting it down to people and an individual person. Cool. The second definition is talking about a character or part as if in a play. We're not talking about that. That's not what we're talking about. So we're going to ignore the theater aspect. We're also going to ignore definition number 3, which is the unitary personality of Christ and blah, 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 blah. We're not talking about religion. Ignoring that one. Number 4, however, is important. Kind of gets at a little bit of number 1. Number 4 talks about, the number 4 definition of person in the dictionary talks about needing to describe or have the bodily appearance as a human being. Which once again just reinforces this idea that you have to be human and you have to look human. All right? Number 5, the personality of a human being. Look at that. Another characteristic that is distinctly human. You have to look like a human. You have to act like a human. You have to have emotions like a human. Right? Number 6 gets at a slightly different perspective, though. This gets at more the legal kind of side of things because it is very important. It is important to take into account what the law says a person is or is not. So definition number 6 here is one that is recognized by law as a subject of rights or duties. So you have to be recognized by law, which means that you have to have some laws in place defending the fact that you're a person. Which is to say, that's what we didn't have for a long time with the African slaves that came to this country. For a long time, they had no laws protecting them as people, recognizing them as people. Took us a long time to get rid of that. That's very unfortunate. Definition number 7 is really an English definition. I'm not really going to rely upon that one, but I'll say it just for funsies. Definition number 7 of a person is reference of a segment of discourse to the speaker, to one spoken to, or to one spoken of. If you're talking about a person, that makes him a person. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Really bizarre, but it's basically just saying if you're talking about a person, if you're talking to a person, then we're kind of assuming it's a human being and that kind of makes them a person. I don't know. Strange English stuff. Point is, not terribly relevant to my discussion. So, a couple of them that I want to lock onto here. The first one that I want to lock onto is human. Because human is a very important thing to keep in mind. Now, traditionally when we speak about human, we are saying very explicitly that you have to belong to the genus Homo and the species Sapiens. You have to belong to that genus and species in order to be considered human. But as we know from the vast amount of things in the human language that involve the word human or man, we have to take into account certain other little nuances, which requires us to look up the definition of human because that starts becoming a little vague, right? It's just like, well, that's, I don't know. That's a little more complex than what I thought it would be. So just to sum up definitions 1 and 2, we can say that being human means of, relating to, characteristic of, or consisting of humans. Okay, that's a lot of stuff. If it relates to a human, If it's characteristic of a human, or if it is a human, then it's human. All right. That encompasses a lot of stuff. A lot of stuff. So I'm at this point, I'm starting to think definition of human is a little more vague than what I thought it was before. So let's look at definition number 3 here. Having human form or attributes. Well, that sounds familiar. That's exactly what we just said in our definition for person. So, all right, that makes sense. Representative of or susceptible to sympathies and frailties of human nature. And there we go, back to being confused. I have no idea. Because if something is sympathetic or frail like humans are, then all of a sudden that makes them human. Well, that's kind of vague, isn't it? Now we get to start going back and thinking, well, is Data human? Well, if he's got his emotion chip in, and if he's acting all sympathetic and frail and stuff, then I guess he must be human. Gosh, man, really thought I could exclude him at that point, but apparently not. Apparently Data is not only a person, but he's also human. That's great. Now I'm really confused. Oh my gosh. Okay, so let's go back to the definition of person, into that first definition of person, where it said human individual. Well, what's an individual? What does that even mean? How do we get to the level of individual? I mean, you think about an individual and you're like, okay, yeah, one person. Of course. You know, you use the definition of a term. You use the term in the definition of the term, right? So, how do you define person? An individual. How do you define an individual? One person. It's just kind of a cyclical process there. But no, individual is a very important thing to kind of discuss here. So let's look up that definition. Well, what's that say? Definition number 2 says that it's something that exists as an indivisible whole or is intended for one person. Like, okay, well, you can't really divide me in any particular way that would still generate more than one person. Otherwise, I would just die. So that makes sense. Okay, yeah, I'm an individual. Yeah, absolutely. Then it says, existing as something intended for one person. Like, oh, well, okay. How can you be intended for one person? That's almost a monogamous kind of statement, isn't it? You're like, well, that's, an individual's shoes, an individual's shirt. You're like, yeah, okay, that shirt belongs to one individual. Like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense. What about definition 3 here? Existing as a distinct entity or separate. All right, now we're getting somewhere. As a distinct entity, as something that is separate from something else. I am distinct. I am separate from anything else. That completely makes sense. If somebody was to say that I'm a part of somebody else, that wouldn't be the case because I'm actually not physically or mentally directly attached to anything else. I am separate. I am a distinct entity. Like, all right, now we're getting somewhere. Okay, because if we start to think about this whole notion that a fetus or a developing embryo is a distinct entity, actually they're not. Because they're not separate from the mother. They are not separate. They are attached. Attached in a very, very durable kind of way. Okay. It's not like I'm just kissing somebody. Okay, that's not the level of attachment we're talking about. We're talking about a very intimate attachment between fetus and mother that exists at the level of the placenta. Okay. And the placenta is basically the blood interface, blood and nutrient interface between the mother and the child. That's a very, very intimate connection. That is not something that's as labile as a kiss. And because of that connection, that makes mother and child not separate entities. Not distinct and separate entities at all. Because they're interfacing so much at that juncture. And to separate them would undoubtedly kill one or both entities. Right. Now, there may be exceptions to that rule, but in general, that's going to be the case. So we have to keep that in mind, that when we consider, that when we try to claim that a fetus is an individual, it is not, because it is not yet separate and distinct from the mother. As soon as it's born, it is. As soon as that umbilical cord is cut, oh yeah, it's distinct and different from the mother. But until that point, it is not an individual, which means that it is not a person. It violates that definition of a person. The fact that you must be an individual. So already, we've thrown out this idea that a fetus is even an individual. Okay, that's already gone. But let's go further and talk about some other aspects of what people generally lump into what they consider a person to be. Okay, so some people at the Mind Project have some very great ideas about this. They actually define a person as being any entity that has the moral right of self-determination. Well, what the heck does that mean? Like, I don't even know. Like, okay, well, let's break that down a little bit. Let's consider some other characteristics. What all goes into this right of self-determination? Like, well, we generally consider a being or an entity to have self-determination if they possess a number of these characteristics. Some of these properties include intelligence. Kind of goes back to what we were talking before about intelligent life on other planets and such. So you have to be intelligent. You have to be able to speak a language, which, if you're intelligent enough, you do. You have to be creative. Right? And we'll talk more about creativity later here. You have to be able to make moral judgments. Okay, now, morality is more of a subjective thing, so we're not going to focus too much on that, because once again, that's kind of a whole nother discussion. All right, we're not really going to get into morality here. Consciousness. Consciousness is definitely something that we can talk about, so we'll get back to that here in a minute. Free will. A soul. I don't even know why they consider soul in this particular case, because souls have already been proven not to exist. All right, that's a whole nother talk that we can have another day. But just as a, right off the cuff, souls don't exist. Humans are not special. Let's just cover that. Then lastly, we have self-awareness. Okay. Typically we consider entities and persons to be self-aware. And we'll come back to that one as well. Now, just to approach some of these different qualities that we tend to see in things that we consider as people, the first one I'd like to talk about is consciousness. Let's go back to the dictionary. See what consciousness really means. So Merriam-Webster says that consciousness is the quality or state of being aware. Well, duh. Of course. Of course it has to do with awareness. Especially of something within oneself. Now that makes it a little more difficult. Okay, that's saying that not only are you aware of your surroundings, but you're aware of your inner surroundings. That is to say, your inner workings inside your mind. Okay? You have to have some sort of way of almost evaluating and analyzing your own behavior and your own thoughts. And that's really kind of what we're getting at here with consciousness, is being able to realize, you know what I'm thinking is kind of stupid. I need to just stop talking. How often do I have those thoughts? Not often. How often does my wife think I should have those thoughts? Very often. She likes to remind me that sometimes I talk more than I really should, and that there are a number of times where I need to just shut up. So my wife would like to see me exhibit more self-awareness and a greater consciousness as far as my performance in a discussion. I need to work on that, but the glory of it is that I can work on that, right? I can consciously make myself aware that I sometimes sound like a moron and I just need to shut up and walk away. But that's the glory about being a human being, an adult, is the fact that I can do that. That's a powerful ability, and having the knowledge that I have that even as an option in my life is extraordinary. I'm not just a product of my environment. I'm a product of my inner thoughts and feelings and responses to my inner self. That's very, very important. So let's go on to look at some other definitions of consciousness. Definition number 2, the state of being characterized by sensation, emotion, volition, and thought. Okay. So if I sense something, feel something, want to do something, want to think something, okay, that makes me have a consciousness. Well, that's a little vague. It goes back to being vague. And you're like, well, technically, if we want to talk about an intelligent robot, well, they can certainly sense things from the environment. They can certainly reach the point where they might be able to feel something about the environment. They certainly have a will to do things and be able to think about things. We can see that as being a possibility for robots in the future. So that actually makes sense. We can see robots eventually getting to the point where they have consciousness. What we consider to be consciousness. Now, obviously, we can throw in some other definitions here. Number 3 just talks about the totality of conscious states of an individual, which once again is just talking about all the little bits of conscious thoughts that an individual is thinking. And then we can also think about consciousness as being an upper level of mental life of which the person is aware. So we have consciousness because we realize that consciousness is something special. It is something beyond just breathing, beyond just moving, beyond just eating. We realize that it's a very special place to be that is a greater product of all these simpler things. And we see that and we recognize that. Now, honestly, I feel like people need to recognize that a little bit more nowadays and maybe unplug from their phones in the process. Get a little self-reflection going on and start thinking about how awesome it is that we can even think about these things outside of stimuli. But that's just my own tangent. That's just me acting like a millennial hater, so to speak, even though I am a millennial, theoretically. I hate calling myself that because when I was growing up, I was Generation X or Next or whatever. I always get confused with generations and the Pepsi commercials that I grew up with. But anyway, point is, consciousness is defined by a lot of ways, but it all comes down to awareness. And being aware of certain things in certain contexts makes you conscious. Now, the reason why we say the word conscious is because we're subconsciously mentioning the subconscious, if that makes any sense. The subconscious tends to handle things that we don't directly think about. Okay, it kind of is like an autocomplete for our functions in order to help streamline them. We subconsciously breathe. generally speaking. We subconsciously direct our heart to beat at a certain rhythm. We subconsciously gauge our blood pressure to be at a certain level. Our body is doing all of these things, and they are below the level of consciousness, which is why we call them subconscious, because we aren't consciously aware of when we're doing them or how we're doing them. Now, that's not to say that we can't exert conscious influence on some of these subconscious activities. I can consciously think about reducing my heart rate, and my heart rate will slow. I can consciously think about controlling my blood pressure, and I can measure that in a blood pressure cuff. I can consciously think about not breathing, and I will stop breathing. So we can consciously alter some things with the subconscious, but that's the great thing about having consciousness, is that we have the ability to do that. We have two separate modes of existence, a consciousness and a subconsciousness. Now, unfortunately, the subconsciousness sometimes gets in the way. Excuse me. A subconsciousness sometimes gets in the way of something that's conscious. Right? So if I have this subconscious feeling that a person looks shady and untrustworthy, and I'm just going to kind of treat them a little more harshly than I would normally treat a stranger. Maybe I won't hold the door open for them. Just because subconsciously I feel like maybe they're a creeper or a criminal of some kind, and I just kind of want to treat them like crap. And my arm will just sit here and it'll open the door and it'll close it behind me. I won't hold it open for the other person. I don't always consciously think about that, but muscle memory and my subconscious thoughts kind of override what I'm doing. But once again, that's the beauty of having a consciousness, is the ability to reflect upon those actions and to try to see why I did that. Like, why would I treat that person like dirt? Just why? And, maybe you start analyzing and you're like, oh my gosh, well, that person reminded me of my mother. That's why I treated them like crap, because I hate my mother. Not saying I do, I'm just saying from the perspective, that some people have. Maybe that's why they end up treating a person badly. It's because they have a bad memory from a family member that person kind of reminds them of. And that would be a subconscious kind of subversion of the conscious mind and of some of the conscious actions and thoughts. And you know what? That's important to be aware of. Very important to be aware of. That kind of gets at the other aspect that the Mind Project was trying to get at, that consciousness can also be defined as a subjective character of experience. Which is to say, it is physically impossible for me to imagine what it's like to be you, and vice versa. Physically impossible for us to imagine what that's like. But that by itself defines what consciousness is. It is impossible for me to imagine being you as much as it's impossible for you to imagine being me, because we both understand that we have consciousnesses, we have very different experiences, and we would experience life in a very different way if our places had been swapped. Unfortunately, this is another stage where we can start being a little more vague, right? So now I can ask, maybe going back to one of the movies that was just recently released here, involving a dog and their particular tale through life. What's it like to be a dog? What defines the experience that a dog goes through in living their life? Because as we know, dogs have been co-evolving with humans for about 13,000 years. Right? That's pretty important. That is a very important length of time. And that coevolution has generated an animal that is unlike any other animal on this planet. The fact that only dogs and elephants can understand a human pointing is extraordinary. Absolutely extraordinary. But you know what? That happened because dogs co-evolved with humans in a way that gave them certain human-like characteristics. And so that begs the question, can we consider a dog to be conscious? Is it really aware of itself? Does it feel like it can reflect on some of the actions that it's done and feel remorse for those actions? And some people would say yes, absolutely. Can a dog second guess itself and feel poorly for some of the conscious decisions it's made? And some people would say, yeah, absolutely. Just like a human does. And that's scary. Because now we're starting to think, well, heck, if that's what defines consciousness, well, we can start lumping consciousness into something that's more than just human, or more than just alien, or more than just androids. Maybe consciousness itself also expands to certain other animals, including dogs and maybe even chimpanzees and dolphins and elephants. Maybe these other organisms are also very intelligent. Octopuses, maybe they're also at the stage where we can consider them as being conscious organisms. Or another word that some people like to throw in is sentient. So that's a question, like, what does sentient mean? Well, we often consider sentient beings to be intelligent, self-aware, and display consciousness. So actually, sentience kind of a more generalized term that includes consciousness. So if we recognize a dog or a dolphin as being conscious, do we recognize them as being sentient? Are they intelligent enough? Are they self-aware enough to also meet the criteria for sentience? And well, that's a question. So what other qualities are we kind of talking about here when we talk about sentient beings? Well, here we're talking about beings that possess some sort of creativity. Right? A great example of this is just talking about our ability to not create the same mistake over and over and over and over and over again. Now, granted, if you talk to my wife, she might give you a completely different story about how I never learn, as far as never learning how to do laundry right, or how to take the dog out right, or whatever. Okay, she may argue with you that I'm not sentient, just because of some of those stupid things that I don't seem to learn from. But when we're talking about other organisms, we're really talking about a case like with this Sphex wasp. All right, and with the Sphex wasp, he has a very interesting behavior where he will dig a burrow and lay some eggs in that burrow, go out, sting a cricket, bring that paralyzed cricket back to the burrow, leave it at the doorstep of the burrow, go inside of the burrow, make sure the eggs are still there, then go ahead and go back to the doorstep of the burrow and grab the cricket and bring it inside the burrow. And then he would wall up the burrow and go on his merry way. Now, when we're talking about this, we're basically discussing a situation where the cricket is being permanently paralyzed. Okay, I'm not just talking about a half-hour paralyzation. I'm talking about irreversible paralysis. That is to say, the cricket cannot get away. He's never getting away. He's never going to be able to move again. Now, those eggs, those wasp eggs, are going to hatch inside that burrow, and they're going to eat through that cricket. So the cricket is really just being paralyzed so that he can serve as lunch for the wasp eggs, for the larvae, once they hatch. A little disgusting, but certainly one way to go about survival and ensuring the survival of the next generation. Very, very cool. The reason why I bring up this wasp, even though he's so neat, the fact that when that wasp undergoes this behavior, when he brings that cricket to the doorstep of that burrow and then goes inside the burrow to check on the eggs, if that cricket gets moved away from the doorstep of the burrow and gets moved back, let's say 6 inches or so, that wasp will come out, realize the cricket has been moved, and then move the cricket back to the doorstep of the burrow. And then he'll go back into the burrow just to make sure that the eggs are there, even though he just finished making sure that the eggs were there. And what's funny is that they repeated this experiment 40 times on the same wasp, and the wasp didn't let up. Every single time, the wasp brought that cricket back to the doorstep of the burrow and went back inside to check on those eggs, even though he had just checked on those eggs a few seconds before. That is to say, he kept repeating the same mistake. He was in a rut. He did not display creativity. What he was displaying was a fixed action pattern of behavior. And that's something that is really cool when you start studying animal behavior, is how you start getting into so many of these behaviors that are really just repeated patterns based on certain stimuli. And they really don't exhibit intelligence per se, because they don't exhibit creativity and adaptiveness to the situation. Okay. So when we talk about being in this rut, sometimes people use the term, when thinking of creativity, so to speak, we want to think of this in terms of being able to adapt to a situation and get over some sort of problem. That's really what we're getting at with creativity. And so that's a big part of sentience, of being a sentient being, is that you have that level of creativity to get over that problem, to overcome that obstacle, and move on with life. Yeah. You can almost think of it as discerning the difference between somebody with OCD, extreme OCD, and a normal person. Okay. Person with extreme OCD has to put the spoon on the counter and take the spoon from the counter and put it into the bowl. So if they put the spoon on the counter and then the spoon gets moved from the counter to the bowl, well, then they're going to move the spoon back from the bowl to the counter so that they themselves can move the spoon into the bowl. So not being able to recognize that they have an option, that their job is already done for them, that they need to adapt to the situation, is part of what defines creativity. Now, another part of this is feeling uncertain about the actions that you've taken. You know, if in the Sphex wasp example, if the wasp had sat there at the entrance to the burrow and been looking down at where the cricket just was a few seconds ago, and then looking up at where the cricket is now 6 inches away, and then looking down and looking up and looking down and looking up, like what the heck just happened? Well, that's a human characteristic. That's a human-like characteristic where we sit there, and you see in movies all the time, in comedy movies and such, to where somebody will just sit there and look back and forth between two different things and be like, what the heck just happened? They're feeling uncertain. They're confused. And this feeling of confusion is a part of what makes a being sentient. So it's very, very important to have that feeling along the way. Now, just to bring this back around to our original topic, how can we consider whether fetuses are conscious or not? Well, in this particular example, I defer to the experts. Okay, I am not a reproductive biologist by any stretch of the imagination, but a number of other people are. Okay, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to refer to their research that they have published on this particular topic. And what they have found is that fetuses aren't even capable of consciously experiencing pain until they're 28, 29, or 30 weeks of age. Right? That's really when the pain networks have kind of been set up anatomically and physiologically to work. Now, the other side of that coin is that just because something is capable of working does not mean that it is functional, right? So just because a destroyer looks like it's capable of going out to sea and killing some North Koreans, that destroyer ship does not necessarily have to be functional, even though it looks, to the average person to be a functional ship. It doesn't mean anything. And so just because a fetus has the wiring set up to feel conscious pain does not mean that it's conscious. And part of that is really due to the fact that a fetus and an embryo is under heavy sedation, so to speak, when inside the mother's womb. Okay? It's really prevented from waking up, so to speak. All right? And the only time that really wakes up is when it's born. That's when that chemical signal is triggered and when the baby actually gets kicked out of its perpetual sleep inside the mother. And that's when it finally draws its first breath and when it actually opens up its eyes and starts experiencing the external world for the first time. That's at the point that we really recognize consciousness as existing. And so this is really supported by some research here in 2009 by Lagerkrantz and Changzhou, where they actually showed the fetus does not experience consciousness. They looked at the fetus, they looked at its brain, they said no, does not experience consciousness, but a newborn absolutely does. Now, granted, they only experience a very minor form of consciousness, a very rudimentary form of consciousness until they're about 5 months old, but it's still rudimentary consciousness nonetheless. All right. A fetus still inside the mother does not experience consciousness. And because of that, if we don't have consciousness, then we do not have anything that can be basically treated as an individual or as a person if it doesn't have this consciousness. It's not sentient, it's not conscious, it's not an individual, it's not considered to be a person at that stage. Now, are developing fetuses alive? Of course they're alive. So far as they're a collection of cells, right? We would never consider an organ to be alive because the organ can't live without the interdependence of all other organs inside our bodies, right? So I would consider my heart to be alive, sure. But alive by itself, as an individual, as an entity? No, absolutely not. That heart is dependent on every other organ and every other organ system in my body. If we think about what makes a human, if we think about what makes a multicellular organism like us work, we have cells that form tissues, tissues that form organs, organs that form organ systems, and organ systems that come together to form the individual organism. As such, an organism really only is alive if all of its organ systems and a majority of its organs are intact and functional. If any organ system is not working, death will come very swiftly. You cannot survive without the full functioning of one of your organ systems. We're talking about things like the digestive system, nervous system, endocrine system, talking about the respiratory system, the circulatory system, the skeletal system, integumentary system, which is your skin. If any of those systems fail, you are going to be dead in short order. Now, that's not to say you can't be kept alive on machines, but that's certainly to say that you are in a bad, bad place and that you need help. Because of this definition, when we think about what a fetus is, a fetus does not have all organ systems functioning. It is not breathing air from the environment. Therefore, its respiratory system is not functioning. And the reason why it's not born yet is most often because it hasn't accumulated enough surfactant in the lungs, on the alveoli, to warrant being capable of having a functional respiratory system upon birth. And that's why so many preemies, so to speak, the early borns, those that are born earlier than nine months. I can't even think of what the word is now. But you know what I'm talking about. If you are born long before your time, at like 6 months instead of 9 months, you tend to have respiratory issues. Huge respiratory issues. The reasoning for that is the respiratory system is most often the last system to develop. That organ system is not functional until you are born. If it's not functional until you're born, then you are not a functional human being. Because as I said before, you cannot be a functional human being unless all of your organ systems are functioning. Therefore, you are not a multicellular organism that is an individual organism that is a human. You are not. You are not capable of being that. Okay. And once again, that goes back to the definition of what a person is. You are not an individual. You aren't. Because you are not taking air in through your lungs and breathing on your own. I'm sorry, but that's a really important characteristic. And that's really one of the fundamental ways that we can tell whether something is a person or an individual. Some people will sit here and go on this rant, well, it has unique DNA. Well, so does the cancer in your pancreas. Unique DNA doesn't mean anything. Like, well, it's a collection of cells that looks like a human. Like, okay, that's true, but you're still missing all these other aspects that we just talked about. They're not conscious, they're not individual, not sentient, therefore they're not a person. It's just that simple. So, when it comes to talking about abortion, and as abortion killing a person, the evidence just isn't there. There's no evidence to suggest that an embryo or a fetus is a person. It just doesn't line up with any of the requirements for being a person. Now, as to whether you want to have an abortion or not, that's a different issue. I'm just saying that don't go around claiming that abortion kills a person when a fetus does not meet the definition for a person. So, thank you so much for joining me this week on Based on Facts. Once again, my name is Chris Rex. You can find all of our episodes on YouTube and on Facebook just by searching for Based on Facts along the way. So, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great week.